Okay, so now we're going to move into a little bit different area of the chapter. We're going to talk about more about energy needs and how different animals handle that. So this general concept is called animal bioenergetics. And I want you to kind of think back to your Bio 1 days, and do you remember cell respiration? And don't worry, you don't need to remember all the little details about it, but remember the general gist of this idea that you eat food that gets into your body, that eventually goes through the digestive system, gets into your cells, breaks down to smaller macromolecules like glucose, and eventually undergoes the cell respiration process in order to take a lot of that stored chemical energy that was in all that food you ate and convert it into usable ATP molecules that are the energy currency of the cell. And once you have that, you can use ATP to do all kinds of cell jobs. You can pump things across cell membranes. You can contract muscles. You can build bigger molecules. So in general, cell respiration is the most efficient oxygen-based system that allows most animals to take in food they eat and convert it into usable forms of energy. So the amount of energy that's expended by a particular animal over time to do all of its cell jobs is ultimately called its metabolic rate. And there's different ways you can measure the metabolic rate, depending on if you are, different types of animals, invertebrates versus vertebrates. And again, for this class, we are not going to delve into all the details in the measurements of, the exact amount of kilojoules of energy and all that type of thing. But I just want you to kind of understand this general concept that every animal has a metabolic rate, and it's generally the amount of energy that's expended to do all of those individual cell jobs. Now, we talked about endotherms and ectotherms a little bit when we talked about the different types of animals as we move through invertebrates and vertebrate classes. In general, remember, endo means inside. And so these are classes of animals like mammals or birds, for the most part, that conserve their own body heat. Because one of the things about all of this cell respiration process and the conversion of energy is that often energy gets released in the form of heat energy. And the measure of how much that animal could conserve some of that heat energy is dependent upon the type of lifestyle, the type of animal it has. So an endotherm tends to conserve its own heat energy and use it for its metabolic processes. An ectotherm, meaning outside, must actually use the environment's heat. And this is, again, when we talked about things like reptiles, where they have to bask and lay out in the sun. And we'll get back to the endo and the ectotherms in a little bit. But just kind of reminding you of those terms. Now, in general, remember we talked about smaller versus larger animals. This is where size comes into play. In general, when you're talking about endotherms, the smaller the endotherm, they tend to lose more heat. And it comes back to that surface area, to volume ratio, again, being very high. So while that was a benefit when you're trying to diffuse across the surface, when you're a smaller endotherm, that means you're going to lose a lot more heat energy. So therefore, you need to compensate by having a higher metabolic rate to try to keep that body temperature stable. So when you think of small animals compared to larger animals, for one very obvious thing you can measure is that they tend to have much higher heart rates. This even applies to babies. Human babies have a much higher heart rate than you would as an adult. And so that's something that we kind of see universally across the environment with all kinds of small animals versus larger animals. So when we're dealing with this idea that you really need to conserve this energy, a lot of animals have developed different ways to accommodate, and one of the things is that, energy requirements is obviously related to activity levels. So one of the things you can do is, in order not to have to consume more energy, is to have your activity level be lower. And this is something that obviously you're going to see in different animals. You could even see it, here's a nice bulldog who is taking his afternoon nap. I see this in my own dogs. I have two dogs. One is a very, very high energy, wanting to play all the time, frisbee loving kind of dog, never stops. The other one is a total couch potato. He's got really low energy requirements. His activity level is really low. So you can definitely see this, between individual types of animals. But in general, we want to look at the amount of food that is needed to sort of maintain the metabolic rate, and it can definitely be influenced by activity level. Sort of an extreme example of this is little tiny hummingbirds. And if you know anything about hummingbirds, they spend their entire day looking for food, for nectar. And they have an incredibly high metabolic rate just to maintain the activity of their flying and the way their wings are beating. Almost you can't even see them. And literally, hummingbirds are always within hours of starving to death because they have such a high metabolic rate. They must constantly consume that food. If they don't get enough, even within 1 day period, they could quite literally run out of energy. So again, it depends upon the different requirements that an animal has evolved to handle. Now, the amount of energy that is expended can also have an environmental influence. So not just your activity level, but for example, this is a good example of sea otters, which are super adorable, but these are one of the, really the smallest marine mammal, and they have this incredibly beautiful fur coat, which of course was what hunters used to hunt them for. But that fur coat for the otter is to help insulate them, to help keep them warm, because they actually, unlike a lot of marine mammals, don't have blubber, don't have that bad insulation, and they live in very cold environments in the sort of northern coast of California and all the way up into Alaska. And they spend most of their day, if you know anything about sea otters, they're floating around on the surface, like in this picture, but they dive down and spend almost 50% of their time foraging for food. And their food items are things like sea urchins and abalone and types of things that live in the kelp forests. In general, they have to maintain, again, they are endotherms, and they have to maintain this very high um, metabolic rate to actually counterbalance the loss of a lot of their heat energy in this cold environment. And it's estimated that sea otters have to eat up to 30% of their body weight in a given day just to support that metabolic rate. So think about, no matter how much you weigh, if you had to eat 30% of your body weight in food in a given day, kind of think about how much food that would possibly be. A lot of animals, though, to kind of counteract, needing to have that high energetic, sort of keep eating, undergo what we call torpor. And in general, torpor is a term that describes any animal that sort of decreased its activity and metabolic rate. So therefore, you don't need to consume as much energy. So it could be something sort of as, sort of your afternoon siesta nap, where you're just kind of not being as active. Obviously, a lot of animals will undergo this in a daily fashion, as well as much larger swings in energy level depending on the season of the year. And the most common thing that most people are familiar with is the hibernation event that a lot of animals, endotherms, mammals that live in very cold environments during the winter, of course, their food sources are going away because it's cold and snowy and nothing's growing outside. And on top of it, it's very cold. And so therefore they need to really help maintain their energy levels. And so typically true hibernation, which actually bears, even though they're in this picture, don't really undergo a true hibernation where they completely shut down, but generally for very long periods of time, they have reduced body temperature, they have slower heart rates and breathing. In general, they just sort of shut everything down so that they're not having to meet as high that energetic need. Like I said, bears don't truly hibernate the entire winter. This is a little bit different than animals that just go into more of a deeper sleep. But some animals truly go into hibernation for the entire winter and therefore really shut off what they need energetically. Kind of the similar effect, but when it's really hot. This is called estivation. And estivation is sort of an extended torpor type of state where it's very hot and very dry. And so that's also going to be very taxing to the animals that live there. They will go into, again, sort of a state where they kind of lower their metabolic rate, lower their energetic needs. And again, it's not something that we typically, so we tend to associate it with some of desert animals like this lizard that you're seeing here. But there's even endotherms, some of the desert dwelling animals like desert ground squirrels will enter this estivation state at the very, very height of the summer when it's really hot. Although you do have a lot of organisms that do a little bit shorter term on a daily basis where they just tend to stay out of the sun and kind of reduce their metabolic rate during the really high heat of the day. But a true estivation is a little bit longer term event, just like in hibernation.